I want to welcome you, all the viewers, to our today's talk with Professor Dr. Herbert Reginbogin. I'm speaking on behalf of the International Institute for Peace. Our topic today is neutrality. Not so much known is that December 12th is the International Day of Neutrality. The United Nations General Assembly adopted 2017 the resolutions 71-275 when it declared December 12th to the Neutrality Day. So we will speak a little bit about this resolution and about the Neutrality Day, but then more in general about what neutrality means for the future. I'm very glad that we can speak to Professor Dr. Herbert Reginbogin. He is Professor of International Relations and International Law at the Catholic University of the American Institute for Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He worked extensively on permanent neutrality, dimensions of neutrality all over the world, also related to the US-Russian relations, but also to in other hotspots like the Greater Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean and the Far East. Professor Reginbogin has taught at universities on both sides of the Atlantic. I just mentioned some of them: the Touro Law School with branches in New York and Berlin, the European University of Lefke in Cyprus, the Bosporus University in Turkey, Kag University, Turkey, Potsdam University, Germany, Kiel University at the Rhine in Germany, and he has several affiliations and guest lectures to prestigious universities all over the world. He holds a PhD from Touro College Jakob Fuchsberg Law Center in New York, and Licentiatus Philosophy from the University of Bern, and a BA from Wichita College. He extensively published, especially to neutrality. He co-edited books, wrote books, and the most recent ones were Notions of Neutrality, together with Pascal Lothar, and also a forthcoming book, Permanent Neutrality, also co-edited by Pascal Lothar. Herbert, as I mentioned, December 12th, Day of Neutrality, and this resolution 71-75 refers to the obligations of the member states of the United Nations enshrined in Article 2 of the UN Charter, especially to the settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. So what is the relation between neutrality and these obligations by the UN member states?
The United Nations has a general aim to achieve world peace, and it has not accomplished that goal. With the resolution declaring International Day of Neutrality, you have a confirmation, a recognition that neutrality is contributing to international security. In contrast to earlier times where it was portrayed as aloof, not engaged, it is engaged. It's engaged in dealing with what is called preventive diplomacy. It is engaged in looking at possible conflicts before they become a major dispute. In that regard, the resolution underscores all the different types of activities that a neutral should choose this policy in its national interest to provide mediation, peacekeeping, good offices, humanitarian help. This is a very important start in terms of recognizing that neutrality is not about geopolitics. It's not about trying to uphold trade while the belligerents are at war. It's about providing humanitarianism. And this is essentially a new forum because this humanitarianism is actually trying to undermine what nationalists and populism in the 21st century has advocated, which is about sovereignty. Sovereignty that is higher than humanity. And that in our age is the wrong course of action, for which this resolution is a start.
Herbert, let's go a little bit more deeper. You mentioned preventive diplomacy, which is an obligation also enshrined in this UN Charter. What are the means to take diplomatic preventive action? Basically, it means it is an obligation to prevent disputes from escalating into violent conflicts. That means preventing the use of force in conflicts. So what can neutral states specifically contribute to this preventive diplomacy? What are the instruments? What are the tools and means and goals?
The goals, as you've already mentioned, is to prevent a dispute from erupting into a major conflict. And the instruments that we have available are early warning systems. We know how conflicts emerge. They can emerge from ecological issues, shortage of water. They can evolve from areas of religious tolerance or intolerance. The range is very wide. But the resolution says that those countries who adopt neutrality, if they choose also national policies of interest to contribute to the international security through humanitarianism, they can also use what is already codified in the Hague Conventions, which are called the good offices, the mediation. That means that the impartiality of a neutral state, because it's recognized of part of having the credibility of listening and trying to find compromise that will lead to a resolution of the potential conflicts. These are the instruments that these neutrals use.
When you speak about impartiality, does it mean that neutral states always have to keep equidistance between conflicting parties? Or when they participate in peacekeeping operations and peace enforcement operations based on an UN Security Council resolution, that basically means also to take sides once in a while against the conflicting party in order to keep the peace or to make peace. So what is neutrality in this? Is impartiality, neutrality the same thing, or is it a different story? Neutrality can mean taking sides and not always keeping equidistance, or does it mean always to keep the same attitude to both conflicting parties?
The Swiss use a very interesting word called parity when they deal with the economic trading with both sides. The word parity means that they must at least show that they are engaged with both sides in a fair and equitable manner. What that means in diplomatic circles is that the engagement is positive engagement, meaning that the mediator, in this case the neutral, is going to speak very frankly about what the situation contains and what are the possible options for its outcome. It's going to try to be reasonably understood by the conflicting parties, that it's not taking one side or the other, but it's trying to speak a very clear and realistic portrayal of what is occurring, or what the world community stands for. And the world community will not wait if international peace is jeopardized.
You're saying neutral states have to engage with both or all sides. So that's a very different understanding of neutrality than the common understanding of neutrality was in the past. Neutrality in the past, in many ways, was understood of staying out of conflicts, not participating, basically kind of isolating themselves from the outside world. So in Swiss terms, the concept of Stille sitzen, so doing nothing. So that's basically the opposite. If you talk about engaged neutrality, than the common understanding in the past. How come that this definition of neutrality changed so much over time?
Because of the neutral countries' economic interests, the trade that was important for survival during such conflicts. This was historically always the case. And to say that they were aloof to the point that they just sat on the sidelines is not really historically correct. What we can say is the neutrals did not really take a peacekeeping role. That is different. They are now engaged in trying to stop a belligerency between, or a conflict between countries. They're engaged in trying to mediate these potential outbreaks of war. So the neutrals, in their own self-interest, were already engaged with negotiations with the belligerents so that they could have an agreement about the kind of trade and the amount of trade that they would be allowed to continue with the acceptance of the belligerents.
So we are talking about conflicts, but has to be neutrality in peace times as well. So what can neutral states do in peacetime? For example, providing mediating places, hosting international conferences, hosting international institutions, organizing summit meetings, maybe giving advice to potential conflicting parties, providing international lawyers and diplomats and facilitators. So what can neutrals do before it comes to a conflict? So conflict prevention is one thing, but organizing peace is another thing.
But much more important, which is not always visible, is the state practice. Because the state practice is what really elevates the norms of humanity and humanitarianism. When the norms demand from superpowers, when the norms require a consciousness for seeking justice, not just peace and security, then the world community is understanding that there are existential issues that affect them, regardless of where the conflict is emerging. So in our 21st century, with climate change, we have shortage and scarcity of water in Africa. When millions of people don't have water accessible for months in a year, they migrate. Where do they migrate? That migration leads to, again, an exodus to other countries where there's overpopulation, there is different disputes about religion, ethnic backgrounds, etc. And that even goes then to an exodus to the migration to Europe or to the United States. These are an independency of our world situation. So what neutrality does is that it practices humanitarianism of trying to deal with those hotspots. And it tries through these engagements to change the understanding of how the world functions, in contrast to a 19th century world of great rivalry of powers, to where we are all in the same boat, where it's not about a zero-sum game of balance of power, but it's about humanity and the sustainability of this development for a win-win situation.
It's interesting what you said. You talked about justice. This, of course, goes beyond this UN resolution 71-275, because this resolution does not mention justice. So you mentioned justice. So neutrality and justice, how are they really related? Does it mean that you cannot stay neutral in the face of grave humanitarian catastrophes, in the face of genocide? So does it mean that neutrality has to stop there? There is no neutrality when it comes to grave human rights violations.
This resolution does contain the word justice. And it reads that the affairs of the state and the settlement of international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. So justice is a very important part of the UN Charter. It's only that it's very difficult and it's not often emerging in the discussion. And that justice is in an institution like the International Criminal Court, where it deals with war crimes since 2002. It deals with those aspects which the Cold War, when this institution was actually discussed in the early 50s, was put on hold because of the bipolarity of the superpowers, conflicts and differences. But now in the post-Cold War era, this institution exists. And with it, norms are developed. There's reconciliation in the 1990s. We have genocide. We have ad hoc tribunal courts. It's called the era of restitution. It's about the injustices of the past. Now, that sounds very nice, very idealistic, but for people who've gone through the terror and trauma of war, a reconciliation is important. It's about living together. It's about recognizing what were the mistakes. How can they build a community together? And that is a part of human security. That's a part of the movement from the state centricism of the past to another evolution, where we are dealing with the existential issues of the world because of climate change and because of all the different norms that have divided the world community. So neutrals, through their engagement, are developing norms, and they are looking at not just the peace and the security, but indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, giving substance to the ideas of justice.
So interesting what you said. You talk about justice, injustice, and you're moving on to human security. But human security is not only about states. Human security is about individuals as well, especially individuals. So, but neutrality in the past was just understood in order to keep sovereignty of states. So how can you relate neutrality and human security when it comes, now we are moving from the state's neutrality to human security of the individual? So what is the link? How do I reconcile this with neutrality?
Humanitarianism. Because the states who adopt the status of neutrality develop national policies which are reflective of their self-interest. It's in their self-interest that conflicts don't emerge in their neighborhood or even in their own country. It's in their interest that they stop a potential major conflict from arising by looking at its roots. And by looking at its roots, by engaging through impartiality, through discussion, through international conferences, or all the other features that are physical, they are contributing to an understanding that this is about the community, about the family, because not every culture is based only on the individual. There are cultures, there are states that embrace the community more than the individual. But whatever the case is, they are interested in making sure the security of the humans, the people, are a priority. And so if it's a national catastrophe, it's the same idea in a secular context. If it's a conflict of religious interpretations or migrations of people,
somehow we lost the connection.
Cause of a conflict, of self-interest to provide humanitarian services.
Mm-hmm. So there are some say what you're saying about humanitarianism, human security, individual, family, protection. Some say, why do we need neutral states for that? So any state just could do this. So what is this specific what neutral states could contribute?
Well, if that was the case, that the world community could do this, then why don't we have that peace and security? Why do states, when they're looking for a broker, an honest broker, someone which is credible, which doesn't take sides, that is not delegitimized because of their own self-interest? This is hard when you're dealing in the world community and everyone is part of some orbit of interest, may it be among the major powers or among large rising regional powers. So who is really in the category to be at least in the acceptance, in the credibility, in the motivation of trying to maintain this balance of impartiality? That's a neutral. And moreover, it's a permanent neutral. And they should adopt that. Because in terms of an occasional neutrality, a permanent neutral is continuously working for those objectives. Because an occasional neutral can also choose at some time to take sides compared to a permanent neutral.
So you're talking about permanent neutrality. Of course, there is this view that some say the Cold War is over and neutrality is a part of the Cold War, which is not true, because you mentioned examples from the time in the 19th century, way long time before the Cold War. And also when we look what you mentioned at the Hague Convention 1907, it mentions, of course, neutrality. There was also before the Cold War, and there have been several neutral states as well, like Switzerland, also Sweden took the status of neutrality. So it's only in the case of Finland and Austria that it happened that neutrality fell during the Cold War, even though neutrality was the exception because the Cold War was about blocks, and neutrality means staying out of blocks. So basically that's the opposite of the Cold War. But you're speaking about neutrality, permanent neutrality, which has a long history, but it will have also a future. So what after the Cold War and looking into the future, what is the role of neutrality in the future? And you looked not only about the neutrals in Europe. So you looked at neutral dimensions in other parts of the world as well. So what is the future of neutrality, globally speaking? So not only limited to this a few European neutrals.
The most recent permanent neutrals is not only Turkmenistan, but Mongolia. And if you look at the regions, which is actually between Russia and China, you will see that there is a lot of conflict, even US interest in that region. To avoid this kind of tension, those two countries, as well as others in the neighborhood, could find neutrality to be not just a buffer zone, but also to have an important role in terms of balancing the tension between superpowers. That they would become not a chess piece for the orbit of one of these countries, but instead can show a balance of interests that serves all sides through trade, through public opinion, through education, through all these types of institutions that permanent neutrals advocate, as reflected not only in the codification of the laws, but also in this General Assembly resolution, because it talks about the role of neutrals, which can be adopted by permanent neutrals. The essential difference between the two is that the countries that are involved in having amount of win-win situations, countries which are advocating balance of power, will find through a permanent neutral a larger credibility than just an occasional neutral. Because then they say, I can at least assume that this will not become some kind of an advocate of my or against my interests. So the superpowers, the major players in a region, will find that permanent neutrality actually serves them in a different way than a country which is just neutral or having their own foreign policy. So it's a very important part of the 21st century that permanent neutrals serve not only as the geopolitical buffer zone, but as a transformation of the discourse of having not just who has more power, who has more advantages, but in terms of collectively bringing the world together in a more inclusive club. An inclusivity that will give more humanitarianism than the old traditional arguments of sovereignty, and that will give more understanding to an age of humanity and humanitarianism.
We slowly have to come to an end, but still I have maybe that's the last question. So if you look at different concepts of neutrality, you mentioned, of course, occasional neutrality, which is staying neutral in the case of war, but it's not permanent neutrality. As you said, in the past, we had this integral neutrality, which basically means an all-sided neutrality, with including all dimensions, economic, military, political. Moving on to differential neutrality, being more selective already, not all dimensions. As you said, engaging or economically with all parties. Then in Austria, we have this term of active neutrality, which was developed by Bruno Kreisky in the 70s, which means also being active in the Middle East, hosting international institutions. We talked about engaged neutrality, which goes beyond already this, in order to move on to preventive diplomacy and the responsibility for peace and security as enshrined in the UN Charter. So engaged neutrality is already a new norm. So if we talk about norms, new norms, looking at the future, you mentioned the word norms. So what would it be the basic norms when we talk about the neutrality looking in the future? You mentioned already some with humanitarianism and human security, which is so. What are the norms you can think of when we say neutrality is important to contribute to the discourse of international relations in the time to come, especially when we have this polarized world as we have now. So with the danger of a great power competition, a great power conflict, when we see the conflict between China and the US, what can neutrals do to provide an alternative discourse?
Neutrals in their preventive diplomacy, as advocated here in this resolution for the International Day of Neutrality, is advocating a link with the Agenda 2030 of sustainability development. That contains the principles of dealing with poverty. It's dealing with gender equality. It's dealing with all the issues of human rights. And it's dealing with it in terms of the General Assembly having already passed this resolution. Now, the reality is that there is certainly a lot of challenges, and that this is considered rhetoric, but it's also considered a goal. It's also considered where neutrals can have a discussion, where neutrals can begin to advocate for these underscored and signed off principles in the Agenda 2030. And because it's not just about the rhetoric, but it's about the substance, that if countries don't have resources, their population will become revolutionary. Terrorism. And terrorism is something where the world community is fighting. And so neutrals and all of the world community have a role they can play. And this is, again, in this framework of the 2030 agenda, a link between the neutrals and the preventive diplomacy that we are all embarking upon in the 21st century.
All right, Herbert, thank you for your insights. That was fascinating talk. It means that there's a lot to say about neutrality, what has not been said yet. So that's a very good and great contribution you made to the discourse we have about neutrality. And the Neutrality Day will be another occasion when we can put forward other debates, and it will be not the last one we have, and will not be the last interview we did with you. I hope we can have another talk. Have not to wait for the next Neutrality Day in next December. There will be lots of occasions in the future, and I'm sure neutrality will have a role to play in the words of conflict we are facing now. Thank you so much, Herbert, and take care.
Thank you for having me on, and have a nice time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.